Hey everyone, I wanted to share with you something. Welcome to episode 71 of Davidson Hang Reflections and Lessons. I wanted to share with you. This is probably going to be one of the hardest videos that I've ever created, but I wanted to share with you because of what's going on with the Asian American hate crimes. I felt like it's my responsibility to at least share with you some of the stories in hopes of stopping some of this Asian American violence and share with you just my perspective. I identify as a, a cis, straight male, Asian. So I'm of Vietnamese heritage. So obviously, my opinions don't reflect every other Asian male, but just wanted to share with you some of my experiences. And I'll link to some of the articles that I've mentioned as well, um, in hopes of educating people a little bit more about some of my experiences that have been quite traumatic and just things that have been going through my mind. So woke up at 6 a.m. today, a lot going in my mind. And if you have any Asian American colleagues, reaching out to them to show that you care, to let them know that you support them and that you're there for them means a lot. I was grateful that Doug reached out to me yesterday. My manager, Carter Perk, asked about it as well as a few other friends have reached out to me on LinkedIn. So I really appreciate you, Amy, and Cole, anyone else who made the effort to learn more about what's going on, or just providing the space for us to kind of talk about some of these like traumatic moments. So I wanted to share. So in I read an article by Michelle Kim, who is a diversity, inclusion, and equality writer. She actually spoke at LinkedIn at one of our events, so I'm glad that she's making an effort. But she wrote an article about, and I'll link to all this as well, so you can take a look at it yourself. But this year there was a 91-year-old Chinese man being shoved to the ground in Oakland's Chinatown, and then there's an 84-year-old Thai man who was killed in San Francisco, and there's been multiple accounts of robberies targeting Asian-owned businesses in Chinatown. And in New York, there was a 60-year-old Filipino man who was slashed across the face from ear to ear, and so on. Right? There's been over 2,550. So just between March and August of 2020, Stop AAPI, which stands for Asian American Pacific Islander Hate, received over 2,583 reports of anti-Asian hate crimes nationwide, and these incidents are pretty unreported, right? I think if English is not your first language, sometimes I know, I can only speak for my parents, but my mom and when you don't when you're not as comfortable with English, there's many reasons why it's underreported, but basically in this article she writes, and I'll just read you some passages of it because I think it just would shed some light on how we're feeling and what's going on through some of our minds. But the jobless rates of Asian Americans and high COVID-19 mortality rates among Pacific Islanders is double that of white and some of their other Asian counterparts. And it continues to be left out of mainstream narratives while discussing the disproportionate economic and health impacts of the pandemic on people of color. I think there's a lot of reasons for this. One of the biggest thing is, if you're not familiar with this, you can just Google the model minority myth. So essentially, what it is in the American psyche, it's the problematic portrayal of Asians in a group of quiet, hardworking, polite, politically silent, and therefore well-behaved immigrants which is created in the 60s to position Asians in opposition to the black community, where the social justice activism was seen as a natural threat to the status quo of white supremacy. So over the years, this politically motivated and fundamentally anti-black myth has successfully achieved its purpose of driving a wedge between Asians and other people of color groups in America, while basically making us invisible and even delegitimizing Asian communities' real life struggles by using economic success of the few to defend the century old unjust systems rooted in white supremacy, anti blackness, capitalism, and colonialism. So, yeah, it has been frustrating to see, black on Asian violence and vice versa. Um, it's in her article, she essentially like talks about, for instance, when we asked to support the amplification efforts and denounce attacks on Asians, some black people criticize the anti-blackness is prevalent in the Asian community. Asians are anti-black. Asians never show up for us. It's Black History Month, and to that I wonder. So will you watch us die? As the cycle continues, we fight anti-racism with anti-black rhetoric and tactics, and anti-racism goes unnoticed, or worse, justified, because yeah. So I mean, this is tough content, right? I'll let you read more on it. So I'm gonna share with you some of the moments where I felt some hate crimes and how it's impacted my life. So I'll share with you 7 instances and stories that I know has greatly impacted me, and I would say even traumatized me at some point. So one of my previous companies, one of the nicknames that one of my colleagues gave me, and basically all the sales guys, which these are the people that you're spending hundreds of hours with, right? Just because of how much time you spend at work. And let's just say like Asian males portrayed by media is not the most masculine, so they would call me like Little D, and that was my nickname for pretty much every time I went to work. And yeah, I would say that's quite traumatizing, right? Like no male wants to get his um his nickname being something that's obviously not very masculine, right? It's fair to say that most men would not want to be called that. And this was going on for pretty much the whole time. So it was a really long time, like the whole year. So that was one instance that has greatly like impacted me, and I was afraid to go to work. Like I was not comfortable. I was not afraid. I didn't feel like I fit in. Um, so yeah, this just reminded me like I should reach out to some of the colleagues there and let them know how I feel, because I just think that's wrong, and if they were to do that to anyone else, I want to at least let them know like the true impact that that's had on me. So in high school, I was a part of track and cross country winter track. So I remember there was a team outing at track practice, and one of the guys um, who happened to be white. I was one of the very few Asians in our track team, but I remember he, in front of everybody, so the girls and the guys cross country and track team, I think there was like at least 30 of us. He just openly like asked me in front of everyone. They're like, "Oh, is it true that like Asian males have like small penises?" And yeah, that's not okay. I get it. As a high schooler, you say stupid things, but I want to share with all of you, because I think to really think about your actions, and let's say you don't do that anymore, but really to understand like the impact that you're having at someone's age that early on, and how that can have ripple effects. It's not okay, right? So Yeah, I definitely want to reach out and let them know how I feel. I'm sure they'll apologize, but I think sometimes we don't realize like how much of an impact we have on others, and just this is something that has been top of mind for a lot. Right, I've gone to therapy about it. I've spoken to other Asian men about it that have also shared with me similar stories. And another time, um, so it's interesting. This was back in high school with one of my best friends. I slept over his house. We would have, when I was in high school, like he was one of my best friends. His parents were super nice, but I remember um, he would say some pretty racist comments to me, and it wasn't okay. He was my best friend. Like how can I not trust my best friend, right? I do think some of it is due to media and media's portrayal of Asians. It's typically like not the most flattering, right? So I think that has something to do with it. Um, and number four, I've even had a previous manager of mine like really question my masculinity, and even has shared with me that I should probably take testosterone because I was not aggressive enough to be like a salesperson, right? So this just perpetuates that motion. Um, there's number five. There's been random moments of me walking around Queens and Brooklyn, and just people just driving, like whether it's Spanish or Black people driving, and this has happened multiple times. Like not only in Queens, but even in New Brunswick, where I went to school, where they would roll down the window and just scream out like Jackie Chan or like karate or just like some real racist stuff. And you definitely don't feel safe when that happens. It's quite uncomfortable. Um, and then there was a moment I remember in college where there was a white fraternity, and one of my fraternity brothers, who's Taiwanese American, was parking his car, and then there were people just. There was a guy who was white that just like screamed out like, "Oh yeah, like you got like Asians can't drive, like you're such a horrible driver," and then it's just uncalled for. Like what's the purpose of saying that? Um, Number six, my wife's younger sister was walking to Target and had a bus of kids pass by her and say like, "Go back to China." This is like right when the coronavirus like was happening back in March, so it's pretty early on, and that traumatized her. Like it's just sad what we have to go through. And then number seven, I wanted to share with you a story about my mom just being afraid to go to Costco because she's afraid of just the hate crimes that are happening, right? So, in summary, I'll wrap it up with in the U.S. There's been 3,800 anti-Asian racist incidents, mostly against women in the past year. And interestingly enough, I didn't know this fact, but after reading it, it says Asian women are reported to have 2.3 times as many hate crimes than Asian men. And there's a nonprofit called Asian American Pacific Islander Data said that it's a number of factors. It's effects of poverty, financial struggles. A lot of Asian people have essential working businesses, whether it's Chinese restaurants or laundromats, etc. And the pandemic, right? Donald Trump calling it the Chinese virus has definitely played into the heightened anti-Asian sentiment. So all this being said, like how can you take action? So there's there's four there's five steps that I would recommend as a starting point. There's the murder of Vincent Chin, who was a Japanese, oh, who was a Chinese guy actually that was killed by a white man in Detroit because of what was going on with. He just assumed, he just made the correlation. Okay, this guy's Asian. He must be Japanese. This guy isn't Japanese, but he ended up being murdered because of a lot of the jobs in Detroit were getting. They felt like it was getting outsourced, and Japanese people were taking their jobs. So he was murdered, and there was nothing that ever happened. It was really sad. I could read you a little bit more about it. So this happened in. So he died in 1982. He was a Chinese American draftsman who was beaten to death by two white men. So he was a Chrysler plant supervisor, and his laid off auto worker stepson, Michael Nitz. So this happened in Highland Park, Michigan, where he he was essentially, they had used racial slurs as they attacked him, and because of the success of the Japan's auto industry, even though Chin was Chinese, which makes it that much crazier. But he was taken to the Henry Ford Hospital in Detroit, and that the nurse told his childhood friend that he had no chance and his brain was dead, and he died of injuries 4 days later. So both of the men were charged. They were charged with second degree murder, but then they bargained down to manslaughter and pleaded guilty in 1983, and they were just ordered to pay $3,000 and serve 3 years probation with no jail time, which is just a crazy. It's just crazy. Um, so that was, that was tough. So Detroit Chinese Welfare Council said that it amounted to a $3,000 license to kill Chinese Americans. So that was a critical turning point for Asian American civil rights engagement, for stronger rallying for stronger federal hate crime legislation. The other four articles that I'll link to is called there's the Chinese Massacre of 1871, and then the article that I just mentioned by Michelle Kim on anti-Asian hate crime, and then the article, the most recent Dead 8 in the Atlanta spa shootings. So, and then lastly, I also wanted to share with you about the model minority myth. So if anyone's curious, I'll probably be doing more videos as I sort of unpack these emotions. But yeah, thanks for making it this far. If you listen to this far, would love for you to take action by doing nothing. That's saying something as well, right? That's how I feel, because I think as a leader, sometimes you're called to have these more uncomfortable conversations. So reach out to me if you have any questions, if you have any feedback, and thanks for listening.